Welcome, seekers of the unsettling, to a journey into the darkest corners of human experience. Tonight, we delve into a realm rarely spoken of, a place where the veil between worlds is thinnest, and the echoes of what once was linger long after the final farewell. We are talking about the crematory and the men and women who stand at its threshold, witnessing the final fiery transformation. Their stories are not for the faint of heart, for they speak of encounters that defy logic, challenge belief, and leave an indelible mark on the soul. Prepare yourselves, for what you are about to hear will redefine your understanding of the afterlife, and perhaps even your perception of reality itself. These are not mere tales. They are chilling confessions from those who have faced the unimaginable. And trust me, after tonight, you will never look at a flickering shadow or a sudden chill in the same way again. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some voices, once heard, will haunt your dreams forever. Before we dive into these chilling tales, if you find yourself captivated by the mysteries of the unknown, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more unsettling stories to light. Our first chilling account comes from a seasoned operator, a man who thought he had seen it all, until he encountered the inexplicable. Arthur had been a crematory operator for 25 years, a quarter-century spent in the quiet, sterile confines of the facility, overseeing the final, fiery journey of countless souls. He was a man of routine, of precision, of unwavering logic. The hum of the machinery, the precise temperature gauges, the methodical process of preparing remains, these were his constants. He had seen grief, despair, and sometimes a quiet acceptance in the faces of the bereaved. He had handled the remains of saints and sinners, paupers and kings, each reduced to the same handful of ash. Nothing, he believed, could surprise him anymore. Nothing could shake his professional composure. He was wrong. It was a Tuesday night, a particularly quiet one. The air outside was still, a heavy, humid blanket that promised a storm. Inside, the crematory was its usual self, a symphony of low hums and the occasional hiss of gas. The body on the gurney was that of an elderly woman, a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who had passed peacefully in her sleep at the ripe old age of 92. Her file indicated a life well lived, a large family, and a quiet departure. Arthur had processed hundreds like her. He wheeled her into the retort, the heavy door sealing with a soft thud, and initiated the cycle. The digital display flickered to life, showing the temperature steadily climbing, the familiar dance of combustion beginning. He settled into his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, and began filling out the necessary paperwork. The hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic whirring of the fans and the occasional crackle from within the retort. When the cycle completion alarm chimed, Arthur stretched, feeling the familiar stiffness in his joints. He approached the retort, the heat still radiating from its steel shell, and opened the door. The cooling tray slid out, revealing the expected pile of fine, gray-white ash. He reached for the rake, a tool he had wielded countless times, to begin the process of gathering the remains. And then he saw it. Nestled amidst the ash, stark against the gray, was a hand, a human hand. Not a bone, not a fragment, but a perfectly preserved, pale, lifelike hand. It was small, delicate, clearly feminine, with slender fingers and neatly trimmed nails. It lay there, as if placed with deliberate care, untouched by the inferno that had consumed the rest of Mrs. Vance. Arthur stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. The temperature inside the retort reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing organic could survive that. Nothing. Yet there it was. He reached out, his own hand trembling slightly, and poked it with the rake. It felt solid, real, with the disconcerting texture of cool, smooth skin. He pulled his hand back as if burned, despite the cold. His logical mind raced, searching for an explanation. A foreign object? A prank? But who would play such a macabre joke? And how could anything have been introduced into the sealed retort? He checked the chamber, the intake vents, the exhaust. Everything was as it should be. The hand remained, an impossible anomaly. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. As he watched, the fingers of the hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, curled inward. It wasn't a spasm, not a post-mortem contraction. It was a deliberate, agonizingly slow movement, as if the hand were trying to grasp something, to reach for something that wasn't there. A faint, cold pressure seemed to emanate from it, a sensation that prickled his skin and sent a shiver down his spine. He swore he felt a phantom grip, a ghostly squeeze on his own hand, even though he hadn't touched it directly. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at his composure. This wasn't logical. This wasn't routine. This was something else entirely. He quickly slammed the retort door shut, the clang echoing through the silent room. He reinitiated the cremation cycle, cranking the temperature higher than necessary, as if to obliterate the impossible. He watched the digital display, his eyes fixed on the rising numbers, a desperate hope that this time, the hand would be gone, reduced to the same dust as the rest. He didn't leave the control panel until the cycle was complete, and the retort had cooled enough to open again. When he finally did, the cooling tray was empty save for the fine ash. The hand was gone. A wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He quickly gathered the ashes, placed them in the urn, and sealed it. He wanted to forget, to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue, a trick of his aging eyes. But the image of that unburnt hand, so lifelike, so out of place, was seared into his memory. And the chilling sensation of its phantom grip, that faint, cold pressure on his own hand, it clung to him like the scent of smoke, a permanent stain on his sanity. He found himself constantly checking his hands, flexing his fingers, as if to reassure himself that they were still his own, still under his control. The crematory, once a place of predictable routine, had become a chamber of unsettling possibilities, a place where the impossible had, for one terrifying moment, become undeniably real. He never spoke of it, not to his colleagues, not to his family. How could he? Who would believe him? But every time he initiated a cremation, a cold dread would settle in his stomach, and he would watch the temperature gauge with a new, unsettling vigilance, forever haunted by the hand that refused to burn. Maria, a meticulous and empathetic operator, always handled the ashes with the utmost respect. One evening, while preparing the remains of a young man who had died tragically, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible whisper emanating from the urn. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the old building's ventilation. But the whispering persisted, growing clearer, forming fragmented words. It sounded like a plea, a desperate, mournful sound. Maria, unnerved, tried to ignore it, but then a distinct voice, soft yet insistent, called her name. It was the young man's voice, pleading for something she couldn't understand. The air around her grew heavy, and a profound sadness washed over her, as if the very grief of the deceased was manifesting. She quickly sealed the urn, but the memory of that disembodied whisper, it still echoes in the quiet moments, a chilling reminder that not all goodbyes are final. Maria was not like the other operators. While some saw their work as a grim necessity, a final, detached service, Maria saw it as a sacred duty. She was a woman of deep empathy, a quiet soul who believed in the power of respect, even in death. She handled each set of remains with a gentle reverence, a silent acknowledgement of the life that had been lived. She would often whisper a small prayer, a simple farewell, as she sealed the urns, a personal ritual that brought her a sense of peace in a place that so often felt devoid of it. One evening, a particularly somber one, she was tasked with preparing the remains of a young man named Ethan. He was only 19, a talented musician who had been taken by a sudden, aggressive illness. His family was devastated, their grief a palpable presence in the sterile waiting room. Maria had seen their faces, the raw, uncomprehending pain, and it had touched her deeply. She felt a profound sense of responsibility to handle Ethan's final journey with the utmost care. The cremation itself was uneventful. The machinery hummed its familiar tune, the temperature gauges held steady. When the cycle was complete, Maria carefully gathered the ashes, her movements slow and deliberate. She transferred them to a simple, elegant urn, chosen by Ethan's parents. As she was about to seal the lid, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves in a gentle breeze. It seemed to emanate from the urn itself. She paused, her hand hovering over the lid. She strained to hear it again, but there was only silence. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the old building's ventilation system, which was prone to groans and sighs. She was tired, emotionally drained from the day's work. She reached for the lid again, and this time the whisper was clearer, more defined. It was a soft, mournful sound, a series of fragmented words that she couldn't quite decipher. It sounded like a plea, a desperate, sorrowful murmur. Maria's heart began to beat a little faster. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had heard stories, of course, whispers among the other operators of strange occurrences, of fleeting shadows and unexplained noises. But she had always dismissed them as products of overactive imaginations, of minds worn down by the constant proximity to death. Now she wasn't so sure. She leaned closer to the urn, her ear just inches from the opening. The whispering grew more insistent, the words still jumbled, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. A profound, heart-wrenching sadness. And then, a single, clear word emerged from the murmurs. A word that sent a chill down her spine. "Help!" Maria recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a young man's voice, soft and pleading. It was Ethan's voice. She had heard a recording of him singing, a beautiful, haunting melody that his parents had played for her. The voice from the urn was the same, but stripped of its music, filled only with a desperate, ethereal sorrow. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A wave of profound sadness washed over Maria, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. It was as if the very grief of the deceased, the raw, untethered sorrow of a life cut short, was manifesting in the room, seeping into her very being. She felt a phantom touch on her shoulder, a cold, comforting hand that she knew wasn't there. She wanted to run, to flee the room and the impossible sound. But her empathy, her sense of duty, held her in place. She couldn't just abandon him, not if he was truly reaching out. She whispered, her voice trembling, "Ethan, is that you?" The whispering stopped. The room fell silent, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. And then, a new sound, a soft, melodic hum, seemed to fill the air. It was the melody she had heard him sing, a wordless, ethereal tune that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was a song of farewell, a final, gentle goodbye. As the last notes faded, the heavy presence in the room lifted. The air grew lighter, the profound sadness replaced by a sense of peace, of release. Maria, her eyes filled with tears, slowly, reverently sealed the urn. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she had just witnessed something extraordinary, something sacred. She had helped a lost soul find its way, a final act of compassion in a world that so often felt devoid of it. She never spoke of the whispering ashes, of the disembodied voice that had called her name. It was a secret she kept locked in her heart, a sacred trust between her and the young man who had reached out from beyond the veil. But the memory of that encounter, of the beautiful, heartbreaking melody that had filled the sterile room, it still echoes in the quiet moments, a chilling reminder that not all goodbyes are final, and that sometimes, the most profound connections are forged in the very heart of death itself. She continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose, her prayers no longer just a ritual, but a genuine conversation with the souls she was helping to guide on their final journey. And sometimes, in the quiet hum of the crematory, she could almost hear a faint, melodic reply. David, a night shift operator, was used to the solitude of the crematory. It was usually quiet, save for the hum of the machinery. One night, he felt a distinct drop in temperature in one specific corner of the room, far from any drafts. He shrugged it off, but then he heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across concrete, coming from that same cold spot. He investigated, finding nothing. Yet the scratching continued, moving, circling him. He felt a light touch on his arm, a fleeting, icy sensation that made his skin crawl. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The air grew heavy, and he felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, a palpable presence that was not human. He fled the room, heart pounding, and refused to enter it alone for weeks. The memory of that unseen entity, and the chilling certainty that something was there, just beyond the reach of his sight, still makes him check over his shoulder in empty rooms. David was a creature of habit, a man who thrived on predictability. His life as a night shift crematory operator suited him perfectly. The quiet hum of the machinery, the predictable rhythm of the cremation cycles, the solitude, it all contributed to a sense of calm control. He rarely encountered anyone during his shifts, and the few interactions he did have were brief and professional. He considered himself immune to the superstitions and ghost stories that sometimes circulated among the newer staff. He dealt with the dead, yes, but they were just bodies, inert matter undergoing a final transformation. Or so he believed. It was a particularly dark and still night, the kind where the outside world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the crematory, the usual mechanical symphony played on, a comforting backdrop to David's meticulous work. He was in the main processing room, preparing a new set of remains for the retort, when he felt it. A distinct, sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't a draft. The room was sealed, the ventilation system humming steadily. This was localized, a pocket of intense cold in the far corner of the room, near the old and used embalming table. David, a practical man, frowned. Perhaps a faulty vent? He made a mental note to check it later. He continued his task, but the cold lingered, a persistent, unsettling presence. And then he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across concrete. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, easily mistaken for the settling of the old building or the distant creak of pipes. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the same cold spot. David paused, his head cocked, listening intently. The scratching continued, a soft, insistent rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Silence. He walked towards the corner, his heavy work boots echoing on the polished concrete floor. He swept his flashlight beam across the floor, the walls, under the table. Nothing. No loose debris, no scurrying rodents, no visible source for the sound. He even ran his hand along the concrete wall, feeling for any rough patches that might explain the scratching. The wall was smooth, cold. He turned to leave, dismissing it as a trick of his tired mind. But as he took a step, the scratching resumed, this time directly behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Still nothing. The cold spot seemed to expand, enveloping him in its frigid embrace. He could see his breath in the air, a faint mist in the otherwise warm room. A prickle of unease began to crawl up his spine. He tried to rationalize it again. Old building, drafts, but the cold was too intense, too focused. And the scratching, it was too deliberate. He stood there, frozen, listening. The scratching started again, closer this time, moving in a slow, deliberate circle around him. It was as if something unseen was pacing, observing him, its unseen claws scraping against the floor. He felt a light touch on his arm, a fleeting, icy sensation that made his skin crawl. It was like a spider web, but colder, more substantial. He slapped at his arm, but there was nothing there. Yet, the sensation lingered, a phantom chill that refused to dissipate. "Who's there?" David demanded, his voice now laced with a tremor he couldn't control. The scratching stopped. The cold intensified, pressing in on him from all sides. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, a palpable weight on his chest, as if something was standing directly in front of him, its unseen eyes boring into his very soul. He could almost feel its breath, cold and stale, on his face. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting around the empty room, desperate for a logical explanation, a visible source for his terror. But there was none. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stumbled over a gurney, nearly falling, and then he ran. He ran out of the processing room, through the hallway, and didn't stop until he was safely in his small office, the door locked behind him. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his office, the lights on, the radio playing loudly, trying to drown out the memory of the scratching, the cold, the unseen presence. He refused to enter the processing room alone for weeks, always finding an excuse to have a colleague accompany him, or waiting until the day shift arrived. He would glance nervously at the corner where he had felt the cold, a shiver running down his spine even in the warmth of the day. The experience fundamentally altered David. The predictable, controlled world he had built for himself had been shattered by an encounter with the inexplicable. He found himself checking over his shoulder in empty rooms, jumping at shadows, and listening intently to every creak and groan of the old building. The memory of that unseen entity, and the chilling certainty that something was there, just beyond the reach of his sight, still makes him check over his shoulder in empty rooms. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that some things, once disturbed, never truly leave, and that the dead, sometimes, are not as inert as we believe. The crematory, once his sanctuary, had become a constant reminder of the thin veil between worlds, a place where the unseen could, and did, reach out. Sarah, a relatively new operator, was still getting accustomed to the unique smells of the crematory. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult cremation of a hoarder, the distinct smell of old, damp books and stale cigarettes permeated the air, even after extensive cleaning and ventilation. It was overwhelming, nauseating. She opened windows, turned on industrial fans, but the scent persisted, following her from room to room. It wasn't just in the air. It felt like it was clinging to her clothes, her hair, even her skin. She went home, showered, and changed, but the smell remained, faint but undeniable. Days turned into a week, and the phantom scent of decay and old paper continued to haunt her, especially when she was alone. She eventually had to take a leave of absence, unable to shake the feeling that the deceased's essence, or perhaps something else, had somehow permeated her very being, a scent that refused to be cremated. Sarah was a recent graduate, bright-eyed and eager to prove herself in a field that many found morbid. She had chosen to become a crematory operator out of a strange blend of curiosity and a desire to help families find closure. The practical aspects of the job, the machinery, the science of combustion, fascinated her. The emotional toll, however, was something she was still learning to navigate. She had prepared herself for the sights and sounds, but the smells were a different beast entirely. The sterile scent of disinfectant, the faint, metallic tang of blood, the cloying sweetness of embalming fluid, these were the expected odors of her profession. What she encountered one particular afternoon, however, defied all her training and expectations. The deceased was a notorious local eccentric, a recluse named Mr. Abernathy, known for his sprawling, cluttered house and his penchant for collecting anything and everything. He had passed away alone, and his home had been a labyrinth of hoarded treasures and forgotten junk. The funeral home staff had warned them that the body might carry some unique aromas. Sarah had braced herself, but nothing could have prepared her for the olfactory assault that followed. After Mr. Abernathy's cremation, a distinct and overwhelming odor permeated the crematory. It wasn't the acrid smell of burnt flesh, which was unpleasant but familiar. This was a complex, suffocating bouquet of old, damp books, stale cigarette smoke, and something else, something vaguely organic and decaying, like forgotten food or ancient dust. It was the smell of a life lived in isolation, condensed and intensified by the heat of the retort. Sarah, despite the industrial-grade ventilation system, felt her stomach churn. She immediately initiated the deep cleaning protocols, scrubbing surfaces, airing out the room, and running the powerful exhaust fans at maximum capacity. Hours passed. The crematory was spotless, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The fans roared, pulling air through the vast space. Yet the smell persisted. It clung to the air, a thick, invisible shroud. Sarah walked through the room, sniffing, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't coming from the retort, which had been thoroughly cleaned. It wasn't from the floor or the walls. It was just everywhere. It was in the very fabric of the air, a phantom odor that refused to dissipate. She left the crematory that evening feeling utterly defeated. The smell seemed to have followed her. It was on her clothes, in her hair, even on her skin. She could taste it in her mouth, a bitter, dusty flavor. She drove home with the windows down, but the scent remained, a constant, nauseating companion. As soon as she walked through her front door, her usually placid cat, Mittens, hissed and bolted under the sofa, its fur bristling. Sarah showered for what felt like an hour, scrubbing her skin raw, washing her hair twice. She changed into fresh clothes, but when she sniffed her wrist, the faint, undeniable scent of old books and stale cigarettes was still there. Days turned into a week. The smell became her constant shadow. It was strongest when she was alone, in the quiet of her apartment. She would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced her bedroom smelled like Mr. Abernathy's cluttered house. Her friends started to notice. "Sarah, have you been smoking?" one asked, wrinkling her nose. "You smell like an old library," another commented, playfully swatting at her. Sarah tried to laugh it off, but a cold dread was beginning to settle in her heart. It wasn't just a smell anymore. It was a presence, an invisible, intangible entity that had attached itself to her. She began to experience strange phenomena. Objects in her apartment would subtly shift. A book would fall from a shelf when no one was near. The faint sound of pages rustling would drift from empty rooms. She'd hear a soft, dry cough, like an old man clearing his throat, just behind her. She tried to tell herself it was stress, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the smell, the persistent, suffocating smell, was undeniable. One evening, she was sitting on her sofa, trying to read, when the scent intensified, becoming almost unbearable. It was as if she was suddenly back in Mr. Abernathy's house, surrounded by his decaying possessions. She looked up, and there, in the empty armchair opposite her, she saw a faint, shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. And from that distortion, a whisper, dry and raspy, seemed to emanate. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a feeling, a profound sense of possessiveness, of being unwilling to let go. It was Mr. Abernathy, or what was left of him, clinging to her, clinging to the world he had so reluctantly left behind. Sarah screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp. She fled her apartment, not caring about her cat or her belongings. She drove aimlessly for hours, finally pulling over at a roadside diner, shaking uncontrollably. She knew with a terrifying certainty that she couldn't go back. The crematory had been a place of finality, a place where the dead were reduced to dust. But Mr. Abernathy, or his essence, had refused to be cremated. He had found a way to linger, to attach himself to the one who had overseen his final, incomplete journey. She eventually had to take a leave of absence from her job, unable to shake the feeling that the deceased's essence, or perhaps something else, had somehow permeated her very being, a scent that refused to be cremated. She moved to a new city, changed her phone number, and even adopted a new cat, hoping to escape the lingering presence. But sometimes, on a quiet evening, when the air was still and the house was silent, a faint, almost imperceptible scent would drift past her. A whisper of old books and stale cigarettes, a chilling reminder that some things, once attached, are impossible to truly burn away. And in those moments, she knew with a cold certainty that Mr. Abernathy was still there, a silent, unseen companion, forever clinging to the living world through her. Michael, a veteran operator, was preparing a body for cremation, a routine he had performed thousands of times. As he adjusted the shroud, he felt a distinct, icy cold hand grasp his wrist. It wasn't the cold of a deceased body. this was a living, bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very marrow. He recoiled, his heart leaping into his throat, but his hand was still firmly held. He looked down but saw nothing. Yet, the grip tightened, and he felt a sharp, almost painful squeeze. He struggled, pulling his arm free with a gasp, and stumbled backward. The room suddenly felt frigid, and he could see his breath in the air. He fled, leaving the body unattended, and didn't return until morning. The lingering sensation of that icy grip, and the terrifying knowledge that something had reached out from beyond the threshold of death, left him with a tremor that never truly went away. Michael had seen it all, or so he thought. 20 years as a crematory operator had hardened him, turning him into a man of steel nerves and unwavering pragmatism. He had witnessed countless families grappling with grief, handled bodies ravaged by disease and accident, and meticulously overseen the transformation of flesh to ash. He prided himself on his detachment, his ability to perform his duties with efficiency and respect, without letting the inherent tragedy of his work seep into his soul. He was a professional, and professionals didn't get rattled by shadows or whispers. But what happened on that crisp autumn evening was something no amount of professionalism could prepare him for. It was late, well past midnight. The crematory was quiet, save for the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant drone of the city. Michael was alone, as he often preferred to be during the night shift. He was preparing the body of a Mr. Thomas Miller, a man in his late 60s who had succumbed to a sudden heart attack. The paperwork was in order, the family had paid their respects, and now it was time for the final step. Michael wheeled the gurney into the preparation room, the fluorescent lights casting a stark, almost clinical glow on the scene. He began the routine, his movements practiced and precise. He adjusted the shroud, ensuring it was properly positioned. As his hands moved over the fabric, he felt it. A distinct, icy cold hand grasped his wrist. It wasn't the cold of a deceased body, which was a familiar, inert chill. This was a living, bone-chilling cold, an active frigidity that seeped into his very marrow, making his teeth ache. It was as if he had plunged his hand into a bucket of ice water, but the cold was emanating from something that wasn't there. Michael recoiled instinctively, his heart leaping into his throat, a primal surge of adrenaline flooding his system. He pulled his hand back, but his wrist was still firmly held. He looked down, his eyes wide with disbelief, but saw nothing. His hand was gripped by an invisible force, a cold, unyielding pressure that defied all logic. He could feel the distinct shape of fingers, slender yet strong, wrapped around his wrist. He tried to rationalize it, a cramp, a sudden drop in blood sugar, anything but what his terrified mind was screaming at him. Yet the grip tightened. It wasn't a gentle hold. It was a sharp, almost painful squeeze, as if whatever held him was trying to crush his bones. He gasped, a strangled sound escaping his lips, and struggled, pulling his arm with all his might. The invisible hand resisted, its grip unyielding. He could feel the blood draining from his face, his vision blurring at the edges. The room suddenly felt frigid, the air around him growing heavy and dense. He could see his breath in the air, a faint mist hanging before his eyes, even though the room's thermostat was set to a comfortable 70 degrees. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Michael yanked his arm free. The invisible grip released with a sickening pop, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the gurney. He crashed against the wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. He stared at his wrist, expecting to see marks, bruises, anything to confirm what he had just experienced. But there was nothing. No red welts, no indentations, just the lingering, bone-deep cold that radiated from his skin. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by his ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. He looked around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, convinced that something was watching him, something unseen and malevolent. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a chilling certainty that he was not alone. The air was thick with an oppressive presence, a weight that pressed down on him, making it difficult to breathe. He fled. He didn't bother with the body, didn't think about the unfinished paperwork. He simply ran out of the preparation room, through the main hall and out into the cool night air. He didn't stop until he reached his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. He drove home in a daze, the icy sensation still clinging to his wrist, a constant, terrifying reminder of the impossible encounter. He didn't return to the crematory until morning, when the day shift arrived, bringing with them the comforting normalcy of human presence. He tried to act as if nothing had happened, but his colleagues noticed his pallor, the haunted look in his eyes. He mumbled something about a sudden illness, a dizzy spell. They accepted it, but he knew deep down that he would never be the same. For weeks, the lingering sensation of that icy grip and the terrifying knowledge that something had reached out from beyond the threshold of death left him with a tremor that never truly went away. He found himself constantly rubbing his wrist, as if to erase the phantom touch. He developed a nervous tic, a constant flexing of his fingers, as if to reassure himself that they were still his own, still under his control. Sleep became a luxury, haunted by nightmares of unseen hands reaching out from the darkness, their icy grip pulling him into an abyss of cold and terror. He tried to find logical explanations, to dismiss it as a hallucination, a product of stress or fatigue. But the memory was too vivid, the sensation too real. He had felt it undeniably. He had been touched by something from the other side, something that had refused to let go, even in death. The crematory, once a place of predictable routine, had become a chamber of unsettling possibilities, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, and the dead could, and did, reach out. Michael, the man of steel nerves, was now a man haunted, forever looking over his shoulder, forever feeling the phantom chill of an invisible hand, a chilling reminder that some things, once touched, can never truly be forgotten. He continued his work, but with a new, unsettling vigilance, forever aware of the unseen forces that might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to reach out and claim another victim. It was a particularly busy week for Emily, and the crematory was running almost constantly. One afternoon, as she initiated the cremation process for a body, a piercing, guttural scream echoed from within the retort. It wasn't the sound of metal groaning or pipes hissing. It was unmistakably human, filled with agony and terror. Emily froze, her blood running cold. She knew logically that no one could survive the temperatures inside. Yet, the scream persisted, growing louder, more desperate, as if the deceased were still alive, experiencing an unimaginable torment. She frantically hit the emergency stop, but the sound continued for a few more agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting off. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than the scream itself. She found nothing amiss when she checked the retort, but the memory of that impossible sound, that final, tortured cry from beyond the grave, forever shattered her peace of mind. Emily had always considered herself a pragmatist. A former nurse, she had transitioned to crematory operations seeking a quieter, less emotionally draining profession. She understood the mechanics of death, the biological processes, the finality of it all. The crematory, with its precise temperatures and controlled environment, offered a sense of order that she found comforting. She was accustomed to the sounds of the machinery, the low hum, the occasional clatter of tools, even the subtle scent of ozone and ash. What she was not accustomed to, what no one could ever be accustomed to, was the sound of a human scream emanating from within the retort. It had been a particularly grueling week. The flu season had hit hard, and the crematory was running almost constantly, a relentless cycle of intake, preparation, and cremation. Emily was tired, her nerves frayed, but she maintained her professional composure. This afternoon, she was overseeing the cremation of a man in his late 40s, a Mr. Robert Davies, who had succumbed to a sudden, aggressive pneumonia. She had checked his paperwork meticulously, confirmed his identity, and ensured all protocols were followed. She wheeled the gurney into position, slid the body into the retort, and initiated the cycle. The heavy door sealed with a pneumatic hiss, and the digital display began its familiar ascent, indicating the rising temperature within. Emily turned to update the log, her back to the retort when it happened. Piercing, guttural scream. It wasn't a mechanical shriek, not the groan of metal under stress, nor the hiss of escaping steam. This was unmistakably human, raw, agonized, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It was the sound of someone being subjected to unimaginable torment, a sound that bypassed her ears and went straight to her bones. Emily froze, her blood running cold. Her mind, trained in logic and reason, struggled to process the impossible. No one could survive the temperatures inside the retort. It reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, a furnace designed to reduce a body to ash in a matter of hours. Yet, the scream persisted, growing louder, more desperate, as if the deceased were still alive, experiencing an inferno of pain. It was a sound that defied every scientific principle she knew, every ounce of her rational understanding of death. She spun around, her eyes wide with horror, fixed on the steel door of the retort. The scream seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath her feet, a physical assault on her senses. She could almost feel the heat of the flames, the agony of the unseen occupant. Her hands, trembling violently, fumbled for the emergency stop button. She slammed her palm down on it, the red button clicking with a sickening finality. The hum of the machinery died down, the digital display began to descend, but the scream continued for a few more agonizing seconds, a drawn-out, gurgling cry that slowly faded into a choked gasp, and then abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than the scream itself. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with the echoes of that impossible sound. Emily stood there, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs, her body slick with a cold sweat. She stared at the retort door, half expecting it to burst open, to reveal some charred, impossible horror. But it remained sealed, inert, a silent tomb. After what felt like an eternity, Emily forced herself to move. She had to check. She had to know. With trembling hands, she initiated the cooling cycle, her eyes never leaving the retort. When the temperature had dropped to a safe level, she slowly, cautiously opened the door. The cooling tray slid out, revealing the expected pile of fine, gray-white ash. There was nothing amiss. No sign of struggle, no impossible remains, nothing to explain the scream. It was as if it had never happened. She gathered the ashes, her movements stiff and mechanical, her mind replaying the sound over and over again. She sealed the urn, her hands still shaking, and placed it in the temporary storage. She tried to rationalize it. Fatigue? A hallucination? The crematory was an old building, prone to strange noises. Perhaps a pipe had burst, or a metal plate had warped, creating a sound that mimicked a human scream. But deep down, she knew, it had been too real, too visceral, too filled with genuine agony to be anything but what it was. A scream. Emily finished her shift in a daze, her colleagues noticing her pallor, the haunted look in her eyes. She mumbled something about a headache, a long week. She went home, but sleep offered no escape. The scream echoed in her nightmares, a constant, terrifying loop that left her waking in a cold sweat, gasping for air. She found herself listening intently to every sound, every creak of her house, every distant siren, convinced she would hear it again. She returned to work, but the crematory had changed. The comforting hum of the machinery now seemed sinister, the silence oppressive. Every time she initiated a cremation, a cold dread would settle in her stomach, and she would brace herself, waiting for the impossible sound. She started to see things out of the corner of her eye, fleeting shadows that seemed to writhe and contort. She felt cold spots, sudden drops in temperature that had no logical explanation. The crematory, once a place of order and predictability, had become a stage for the inexplicable, a place where the boundaries between life and death seemed to blur. One evening, months later, she was alone again, preparing for a cremation. She slid the body into the retort, her hands still trembling slightly. As she reached for the controls, she heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from within the retort. It wasn't a scream this time, but a soft, mournful plea. "Don't, please." Emily froze, her hand hovering over the button. Her mind raced. Was it another hallucination? Or was it real? Was there something, some essence, that lingered, that could feel, that could suffer even after death? The thought was unbearable. She couldn't put another soul through that. She couldn't be responsible for such an unimaginable torment. With a sudden, desperate resolve, she pulled the gurney back out of the retort. She would find another way. She would call the family, explain that there had been a technical issue, that the cremation would have to be delayed. She would find a different crematory, one that didn't echo with impossible screams and mournful whispers. She would do anything to avoid hearing that sound again, to avoid the chilling possibility that the dead were not as silent as she had always believed. She never returned to crematory operations. The memory of that impossible sound, that final, tortured cry from beyond the grave, forever shattered her peace of mind. She found a new profession, one far removed from the realm of death and the unsettling mysteries it held. But sometimes, on a quiet night, when the wind howled just right or a distant siren wailed, she would hear it again, a faint, echoing scream that would send shivers down her spine. A chilling reminder that some sounds, once heard, can never truly be unheard, and some horrors, once witnessed, can never truly be forgotten. The crematory, for Emily, remained a place of unspeakable terror, a place where the final farewell was anything but final. James, a meticulous and observant operator, was cleaning the crematory chamber after a cremation. The room was well lit and he was alone. As he wiped down a surface, he saw a shadow detach itself from the wall, a dark, amorphous shape that glided silently across the floor and disappeared behind the retort. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light or fatigue. But then, it reappeared, larger this time, and seemed to stretch and contort, as if struggling to take a definitive form. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, weaving between the machinery, never quite solid, never quite disappearing. James felt a primal fear grip him. He tried to rationalize it, but the shadow moved with an undeniable purpose, a silent, menacing dance in the corner of his vision. He eventually fled, leaving the cleaning unfinished. The image of that shifting, malevolent shadow, a silent watcher in the heart of the crematory, forever etched itself into his nightmares. James was a man who took pride in his work, a meticulous and observant operator who believed that a clean crematory was a respectful crematory. He was known for his attention to detail, his ability to spot a misplaced tool or a speck of dust from across the room. He trusted his senses implicitly, relying on them to navigate the precise and often sterile environment of his workplace. What he encountered one quiet Tuesday evening, however, challenged the very foundation of his perception, twisting his trusted senses into instruments of terror. It was late, the last cremation of the day had been completed, and the facility was empty save for James. The main crematory chamber, a vast room of polished steel and gleaming machinery, was well lit, every corner illuminated by powerful overhead lights. James was in the midst of his nightly cleaning ritual, wiping down surfaces, checking gauges, ensuring everything was in perfect order for the next day. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft swish of his cleaning cloth and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. As he wiped down the side of the retort, his eyes scanning the polished floor, he saw it. A shadow. Not his own, not the shadow of a machine or a tool. This shadow detached itself from the wall, near the far end of the chamber, where the cooling trays were stored. It was a dark, amorphous shape, roughly human-sized, but without any discernible features. Simply glided, silently, across the floor. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, a smooth, unhurried motion that defied the laws of physics. It flowed like liquid darkness, disappearing behind the massive, steel bulk of the retort. James froze, his cleaning cloth suspended in midair. He blinked, rubbed his eyes vigorously, convinced it was a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination brought on by fatigue. He was working long hours and his eyes were tired. He shook his head, took a deep breath, and looked again. The area behind the retort was still, dark, and empty. He scoffed at himself. Of course, just his imagination. He resumed his cleaning, trying to dismiss the unsettling image from his mind. But a prickle of unease lingered. He found himself glancing towards the area where the shadow had vanished, his senses on high alert. And then it reappeared, larger this time and closer. It emerged from behind the retort, a swirling, shifting mass of darkness that seemed to stretch and contort, as if struggling to take a definitive form. It was like watching smoke coalesce, but with a malevolent intent. It moved with the same silent, unnatural grace, weaving between the machinery, never quite solid, never quite disappearing. It was always just at the edge of his peripheral vision, a silent, menacing dance in the corner of his eye. James felt a primal fear grip him, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't fatigue. This was real. He dropped his cleaning cloth, the sound echoing loudly in the sudden silence. He stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadow. It seemed to be observing him, its form subtly changing, elongating, then contracting, as if testing the boundaries of its own existence. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. A faulty light? A reflection? But the shadow moved independently, against the light, against any possible reflection. It was a sentient darkness, a living void. He took a hesitant step backward, and the shadow mirrored his movement, gliding closer. He felt a sudden drop in temperature, a chilling cold that radiated from the shadow, seeping into his bones. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive presence. He could almost feel its unseen gaze on him, a weight that pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror he had never known. The shadow began to circle him, slowly at first, then picking up speed, a silent, menacing vortex of darkness. It moved with an undeniable purpose, a predatory grace that spoke of ancient, unspeakable horrors. He could hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to emanate from the shadow itself, a sound that promised unspeakable things. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to disappear, to be nothing more than a nightmare. But when he opened them, the shadow was closer, almost upon him, its form now vaguely humanoid, its edges sharper, more defined. He saw, or thought he saw, two pinpricks of red light deep within the swirling darkness, like malevolent eyes. And then, a cold, unseen force pushed him. He stumbled backward, crashing into a gurney, the metal clanging loudly. The sound seemed to break the spell. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form blurring. Then it flowed away, disappearing into the darkest corner of the room, near the unused embalming table. The cold lingered, a palpable presence, but the immediate threat seemed to have receded. James didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet, his body trembling uncontrollably, and fled. He ran out of the crematory chamber, through the main hall, and out into the night, leaving the cleaning unfinished, the lights still blazing in the empty room. He didn't stop until he reached his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. He drove home in a daze, the image of that shifting, malevolent shadow seared into his mind, a permanent stain on his sanity. He never returned to the crematory at night. He requested a transfer to the day shift, citing personal reasons. His colleagues noticed his pallor, the haunted look in his eyes, the way he would jump at sudden noises. He mumbled something about stress, about needing a change of pace. They accepted it, but he knew deep down that he would never be the same. The crematory, once a place of predictable routine, had become a chamber of unsettling possibilities, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and the unseen could, and did, manifest. For weeks, the image of that shifting, malevolent shadow, a silent watcher in the heart of the crematory, forever etched itself into his nightmares. He found himself constantly checking his surroundings, his eyes darting to every dark corner, every patch of shade. Sleep became a luxury, haunted by dreams of formless darkness pursuing him, its cold touch a constant threat. He knew with a terrifying certainty that some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and that the crematory, for all its sterile efficiency, held secrets far older and more terrifying than any human could comprehend. He continued his work, but with a new, unsettling vigilance, forever aware of the unseen forces that might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to emerge and claim another victim. The memory of that silent, dancing darkness, a living void in the heart of the crematory, would forever be a chilling reminder that some things are best left undisturbed, and some shadows, once awakened, never truly sleep. For years, Sarah had worked alongside her colleague, Tom. They knew each other well, their routines intertwined. One morning, Tom arrived for his shift, but something was off. His eyes seemed a little too vacant, his movements a little too stiff. He spoke in his usual voice, but the words felt hollow, devoid of his usual warmth. Sarah tried to dismiss it as fatigue, but a growing unease settled in her stomach. Throughout the day, she noticed subtle discrepancies. Tom, who always drank coffee black, asked for sugar. He fumbled with a lock he had opened countless times. The final straw came when he mentioned a personal detail about her life that only Tom would know, but he delivered it with a cold, almost predatory smile that was utterly alien. She realized with a jolt of terror that this wasn't Tom. It was something wearing his skin, something that had taken his place. She excused herself, feigning illness, and called the police. But when they arrived, the Tom she had seen was gone, and the real Tom was found later, disoriented and confused, miles away. The chilling realization that something had walked among them, a perfect replica with malevolent intent, left Sarah with a profound and lasting paranoia. Sarah and Tom had been colleagues at the crematory for over 5 years. They were more than just co-workers. They were friends, sharing late-night coffees, commiserating over difficult cases, and occasionally even sharing a dark, gallows humor that only those in their profession could truly understand. Tom was a steady presence, reliable, meticulous, and possessed a dry wit that often lightened the somber atmosphere of their workplace. Sarah trusted him implicitly, knew his habits, his quirks, the way he always took his coffee black, the slight limp he developed after a long shift, the particular way he hummed off-key when he was concentrating. Their routines were intertwined, a comfortable, predictable rhythm that made the long hours bearable. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah arrived for her shift, a little earlier than usual. Tom was already there, which wasn't unusual, but something immediately felt off. He was standing by the main retort, his back to her, his posture stiff, almost rigid. When he turned, Sarah felt a subtle jolt of unease. His eyes, usually warm and crinkling at the corners when he smiled, seemed a little too vacant, a little too still. His movements, typically fluid and efficient, were now jerky, almost robotic. He offered a perfunctory "morning, Sarah." But the words felt hollow, devoid of his usual warmth, his customary playful banter. Sarah tried to dismiss it. Perhaps he was just tired. They had both worked a particularly long shift the day before. She mumbled a reply and went to clock in, a growing unease settling in her stomach. Throughout the morning, the subtle discrepancies continued to accumulate, each one a tiny, unsettling prickle on her skin. Tom, who always drank his coffee black, asked for sugar, then stared blankly at the sugar dispenser as if he'd never seen one before. He fumbled with a lock on a supply cabinet, a lock he had opened countless times, his fingers clumsy and uncertain. He moved with an almost exaggerated slowness, as if he were consciously mimicking Tom's usual pace, but missing the natural ease. Sarah watched him, a knot tightening in her gut. She tried to engage him in their usual morning chat, but his responses were clipped, generic, lacking the familiar spark of his personality. He avoided eye contact, his gaze often drifting to the corners of the room, as if he were scanning for something unseen. The humming, off-key tune he usually sang when concentrating was absent, replaced by an unnerving silence. The final straw came just before lunch. Sarah was struggling with a particularly heavy gurney, and Tom, or the man who looked like Tom, approached to help. As he leaned in, he mentioned a personal detail about her life, a small, intimate anecdote about her childhood pet that only the real Tom would know. But he delivered it with a cold, almost predatory smile that was utterly alien, a chilling distortion of Tom's usual kind expression. His eyes, those vacant, lifeless eyes, seemed to bore into her, not with familiarity, but with a calculating, almost dissecting gaze. In that moment, a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror shot through Sarah. This wasn't Tom. It was something wearing his skin, something that had taken his place. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath. Her mind screamed, asterisk, this is not Tom. This is not Tom. Asterisk, every subtle discrepancy, every unsettling detail, suddenly clicked into place, forming a horrifying mosaic of mimicry. She forced herself to remain calm, to not betray her terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in her ears. "Oh, I just remembered," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not feeling so well. I think I need to head home." She feigned a sudden dizziness, clutching her head. The impersonator's smile didn't waver, but his eyes seemed to narrow almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something cold and calculating in their depths. "Of course, Sarah. Take care." His voice was still Tom's, but the inflection was wrong, too flat, too perfect. Sarah practically ran to the locker room, grabbing her bag and keys. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers clumsy with fear, and called the police, whispering frantically about an intruder, a doppelganger, something that had taken her colleague's place. The dispatcher, understandably, sounded skeptical, but promised to send an officer to investigate. Sarah didn't wait. She fled the crematory, not caring about her car, not caring about anything but putting as much distance as possible between herself and the thing that wore Tom's face. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind? But the memory of that cold smile, those vacant eyes, was too vivid, too real. She finally pulled over at a gas station, her body trembling uncontrollably, and waited. Hours later, a police officer called her back. They had found the real Tom. He was disoriented, confused, miles away from the crematory, found wandering near a deserted stretch of highway, with no memory of how he got there. The impersonator, however, was gone, vanished without a trace. The police, despite finding the real Tom, remained skeptical of Sarah's story. They attributed Tom's disorientation to a possible medical episode and dismissed Sarah's claims of a doppelganger as stress-induced paranoia. But Sarah knew. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The chilling realization that something had walked among them, a perfect replica with malevolent intent, left Sarah with a profound and lasting paranoia. She saw it everywhere. In the subtle shift of a stranger's gaze, in the unnaturally still expression of a passerby, in the way a colleague might pause before answering a question. She found herself constantly scrutinizing faces, searching for that telltale vacancy, that chillingly perfect mimicry. She couldn't return to the crematory. The thought of stepping back into that place, knowing that something could simply take someone, wear their skin and walk among them, was unbearable. She resigned, moved to a different state, and tried to build a new life, far away from the shadows of her past. But the paranoia clung to her like a second skin. She avoided crowds, preferred to be alone, and found it increasingly difficult to trust anyone. Every new acquaintance was a potential threat, every friendly smile a possible mask. Sleep offered no escape. Her nightmares were filled with vacant eyes and cold smiles, with the terrifying image of her own reflection shifting, distorting, becoming something else entirely. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, convinced that the impersonator was in the room, watching her, waiting for its chance. She installed multiple locks on her doors, checked them obsessively, and rarely left her apartment after dark. One evening, months later, she was watching a news report about a missing person, a man who had vanished without a trace from his home. The news anchor, a familiar face she had seen countless times, smiled into the camera, delivering the grim details. And then Sarah saw it. A flicker in his eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible vacancy that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. And then the smile, a cold, perfect smile, utterly devoid of warmth, a chilling echo of the one she had seen in the crematory. She knew with a terrifying certainty that the impersonator was still out there, still walking among them, still taking. And the chilling realization that something had walked among them, a perfect replica with malevolent intent, left Sarah with a profound and lasting paranoia. A paranoia that would follow her to her grave. A constant, terrifying reminder that the faces we trust, the people we know, might not always be who they seem. The world, for Sarah, had become a stage for a silent, insidious invasion. A place where the true horror lay not in the monsters under the bed, but in the ones who walked among us, wearing the faces of our loved ones, waiting for their moment to strike. Mark, a crematory operator for over a decade, began to experience a recurring dream. It was always the same. He was standing in the crematory, the retort door open, and inside, not a body, but a swirling vortex of dark energy. From this vortex, a single piercing scream would erupt, followed by a chilling whisper that spoke his name. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the scream echoing in his ears. At first, he dismissed it as stress, but the dream became more vivid, more real. He started seeing flashes of the vortex during the day, in the reflection of the polished steel, in the heat shimmer above the retort. The whisper began to bleed into his waking hours, a faint, insidious sound just at the edge of his hearing. One night, he woke from the dream to find himself standing in his living room, the whisper now clear and distinct, coming from his own reflection in the darkened window. He stared, horrified, as his reflection's mouth moved, forming the words, but his own lips remained still. The dream, he realized, wasn't just a dream. It was a doorway, and something was trying to pull him through. Mark had been a crematory operator for over a decade, a period long enough to desensitize most men to the grim realities of their profession. He was a man of routine, his days and nights a predictable cycle of intake, preparation, and the final fiery transformation. He rarely thought about the lives that had once inhabited the bodies he processed. It was a necessary detachment, a coping mechanism. But lately, something had begun to chip away at his carefully constructed emotional barriers. A dream, a recurring dream that was slowly, insidiously, bleeding into his waking reality. It always began the same way. He would find himself standing in the crematory chamber, the air thick with the scent of ozone and ash, but colder, somehow, than usual. The retort door would be open, not in its usual, controlled manner, but wide, gaping like a hungry maw. And inside, instead of the familiar, sterile interior, there was a swirling vortex of dark energy. It pulsed with an unnatural light, a deep, bruised purple that seemed to absorb all sound, all warmth. From the heart of this vortex, a single, piercing scream would erupt, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the silence and echoed in the vast chamber. And then, as the scream faded, a chilling whisper would follow, a dry, rustling sound that spoke his name. Not his full name, just Mark, drawn out, elongated, a soft, insidious hiss that promised unspeakable things. He would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, the scream echoing in his ears, the whisper a phantom tickle at the edge of his consciousness. At first, he dismissed it as stress. Long hours, the nature of his work, perhaps a bad batch of late-night coffee. He tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of his mind. But the dream became more vivid, more real. The details sharpened. He could feel the cold emanating from the vortex, the oppressive weight of the silence before the scream. The whisper grew clearer, more distinct, the intonation subtly changing, becoming more insistent. He started to dread going to sleep, knowing what awaited him in the darkness. Then the flashes began. During the day, in the crematory, he would catch glimpses of the vortex. In the polished steel of the retort, he would see a momentary shimmer of bruised purple, a fleeting distortion that vanished as soon as he focused on it. In the heat shimmer above the retort, he would see the edges of the swirling darkness, a brief, terrifying glimpse into the impossible. He'd blink, shake his head, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the flashes became more frequent, more prolonged, until he was constantly on edge, his heart pounding every time he approached the retort. The whisper, too, began to bleed into his waking hours. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as the hum of the machinery or the settling of the old building. But it grew, becoming a soft, insidious sound just at the edge of his hearing. He'd be filling out paperwork, and he'd hear it, a faint, drawn-out mark that would make the hairs on his arms stand on end. He'd turn, expecting to see a colleague, but there would be no one there. He started to feel a constant sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if he was being watched. His colleagues noticed the change. Mark, usually so stoic, became withdrawn, jumpy. He lost weight, his eyes developing dark circles from lack of sleep. He'd snap at minor inconveniences, his patience worn thin by the constant psychological assault. They attributed it to stress, offered him time off, which he reluctantly took. He hoped a change of scenery, a break from the crematory, would banish the dream, the flashes, the whisper. Didn't. The dream followed him home, more intense than ever. The scream was louder, more agonizing, the whisper more demanding. He started to feel a profound sense of urgency in the dream, a desperate need to close the retort door, to shut out the vortex, but his limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by an unseen force. He would wake up screaming, his wife, Sarah, rushing to his side, her face etched with concern. He tried to explain, but the words sounded insane, even to his own ears. How could he tell her about a screaming vortex and a whispering shadow? One night, he woke from the dream with a particularly violent jolt. The scream was still echoing in his ears, the whisper still hissing his name. He was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum. He sat up in bed, gasping for breath, and then he realized something was wrong. He wasn't in his bed. He was standing in his living room, the cool night air seeping in from the darkened window. He had walked in his sleep, a habit he hadn't had since childhood. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, his face pale and gaunt in the faint moonlight. And then he heard it, the whisper, clear and distinct, coming from his own reflection. "Mark." He stared, horrified, as his reflection's mouth moved, forming the words, but his own lips remained still. His reflection's eyes, usually a warm hazel, were now a swirling, bruised purple, mirroring the vortex from his dream. A cold dread, far deeper than any he had ever known, settled in his stomach. The dream, he realized, wasn't just a dream. It was a doorway, and something was trying to pull him through. The vortex wasn't just a figment of his subconscious. It was real, and it was reaching for him. The whisper wasn't just a sound. It was a summons. He was being called, drawn into a realm he couldn't comprehend, a place where the dead were not at peace, but trapped in an eternal torment. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his limbs were frozen. His reflection in the window began to contort, its features stretching and twisting, becoming a grotesque parody of his own face. The purple light intensified, casting an eerie glow on his living room. He felt a powerful, irresistible pull, as if an unseen hand was tugging at his very soul, drawing him closer to the window, closer to the vortex, closer to the impossible horror that awaited him. He didn't know how long he stood there, locked in a silent battle with his own reflection, with the unseen entity that sought to claim him. But eventually, with a final, desperate surge of will, he broke free. He stumbled backward, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. The purple light vanished, his reflection returned to normal, and the whisper faded into the background hum of the night. He lay there for a long time, trembling, his mind reeling from the terrifying encounter. He never slept soundly again. He found himself constantly checking his reflection, especially in darkened windows, searching for any sign of the purple eyes, the moving lips. He avoided the crematory at night, requesting only day shifts, but even then, the flashes of the vortex, the faint whisper of his name, continued to haunt him. He knew with a terrifying certainty that he had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension, something that had chosen him, and it wasn't going to let him go. He started to leave the lights on in his house, even when he slept, a futile attempt to ward off the darkness that now seemed to cling to him. He found himself talking to himself, muttering reassurances, trying to convince himself that it was all just a dream, a figment of his overworked imagination. But the cold dread that settled in his stomach every time he heard a faint whisper, every time he saw a fleeting purple shimmer, told him otherwise. The crematory, once a place of predictable routine, had become a gateway, and he, Mark, the pragmatic operator, had become its unwilling conduit. The dream, he realized, wasn't just a dream. It was a doorway, and something was trying to pull him through, and he knew with a chilling certainty that one day he wouldn't be able to resist the pull any longer. He would step through and join the screaming, whispering souls in the vortex, forever trapped in the impossible torment of the unquiet dead. Thomas, a crematory operator for over 30 years, had always prided himself on his detachment. It was a job, a necessary service. But as the decades passed, a subtle change began to occur. He started to feel a strange connection to the bodies he processed, a faint echo of their lives, their joys, their sorrows. He would sometimes hear snippets of conversations, feel fleeting emotions, as if their very essence was being absorbed into the fabric of the crematory, and perhaps into him. One night, as he prepared the remains of a man who had lived a long, full life, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a profound acceptance of death. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he saw not the retort, but a vast, beautiful landscape, filled with light and tranquility. He felt a gentle pull, a sense of belonging, as if he was being invited to join something greater. He knew with absolute certainty that he was witnessing the man's final journey, a journey he felt compelled to join. He reached out, not to the controls, but to the warmth emanating from the retort, a warmth that felt like home. His colleagues found him the next morning, slumped over the controls, a serene smile on his face, his body cold. The autopsy revealed no cause of death, but those who found him swore they felt a lingering warmth in the room, and a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a final, peaceful sigh, as if Thomas had finally found his own way home through the very fires he had tended for so long. Thomas had been a crematory operator for over 30 years, a span of time that had seen countless lives pass through his hands, reduced to ash and memory. He was a man who had built his life on detachment, on the professional distance required to perform his duties without succumbing to the overwhelming weight of grief and loss that permeated his workplace. He saw himself as a facilitator, a final gatekeeper, ensuring a dignified transition from the physical world. He prided himself on his unwavering composure, his ability to remain objective in the face of profound human sorrow. But as the decades passed, a subtle, almost imperceptible change began to occur within him, a softening of the edges, a blurring of the lines between observer and participant. It started innocently enough, faint echo, a fleeting sensation. When he handled the remains of a young child, he would sometimes feel a pang of innocent joy, a brief, almost childlike wonder. When he processed the body of an elderly war veteran, he would feel a surge of defiant pride, a fleeting glimpse of battles fought and won. He dismissed these as products of his own empathy, his subconscious mind reacting to the stories he had heard, the faces he had seen. But they grew more frequent, more vivid, until they were no longer fleeting sensations, but distinct, almost tangible echoes of lives lived. He started to hear snippets of conversations, faint whispers that seemed to drift from the remains themselves. A mother's lullaby, a lover's promise, a child's laughter. He would sometimes feel fleeting emotions, a surge of anger, a wave of profound sadness, a quiet sense of peace, as if their very essence was being absorbed into the fabric of the crematory, and perhaps into him. It was as if the building itself was a vast, silent repository of human experience, and he, Thomas, was becoming its reluctant conduit. He never spoke of these experiences. Who would believe him? They would call him mad, or worse, suggest he was finally succumbing to the psychological toll of his profession. He kept it to himself, a secret burden that grew heavier with each passing year. He found himself spending more time in the crematory after hours, not working, but simply sitting in the quiet, listening to the echoes, trying to decipher the whispers, trying to understand the profound connection he felt to the departed. One night, a particularly still and heavy night, he was preparing the remains of a man named Arthur Sterling. Mr. Sterling had lived a long, full life, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 97. His file spoke of a life rich with adventure, a loving family, and a quiet, dignified passing. As Thomas wheeled the gurney into the retort, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace emanating from the body, a profound acceptance of death that was almost palpable. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He initiated the cremation cycle, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat at the control panel watching the temperature gauge climb, but his mind was elsewhere. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he saw not the sterile interior of the crematory, but a vast, beautiful landscape. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, bathed in a soft, golden light. A gentle breeze rustled through unseen trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers. A crystal-clear river meandered through the valley, its waters shimmering with an inner luminescence. It was a place of profound tranquility, of breathtaking beauty, a place that felt utterly real, yet utterly impossible. He saw Mr. Sterling there, not as a body, but as a vibrant, youthful spirit, walking through the fields, his face alight with joy. He was surrounded by other figures, equally radiant, their faces filled with love and welcome. Thomas felt a gentle pull, a sense of belonging, a profound yearning to join them. It was as if he was being invited to something greater, something beyond the confines of his earthly existence. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he was witnessing Mr. Sterling's final journey, a journey not into oblivion, but into a realm of peace and light. The vision faded, and Thomas found himself back in the crematory, the hum of the machinery a stark contrast to the serene landscape he had just witnessed. But the feeling remained, a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that filled his heart. He looked at the retort, no longer seeing it as a furnace of destruction, but as a gateway, a portal to that beautiful realm. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was meant to join them. He was meant to follow. He reached out, not to the controls to adjust the temperature, but to the warmth emanating from the retort, a warmth that felt like home, like an embrace. He felt a gentle tug, a welcoming hand reaching out to him from within the flames. He leaned forward, his body drawn by an irresistible force, a profound sense of peace washing over him. He closed his eyes, a serene smile spreading across his face, a smile of ultimate acceptance, of finally finding his way home. His colleagues found him the next morning, slumped over the controls, his body cold, his face serene. The crematory was quiet, the last cremation cycle complete. The autopsy revealed no cause of death. No heart attack, no stroke, no underlying illness. He had simply ceased. But those who found him swore they felt a lingering warmth in the room, a gentle heat that had nothing to do with the machinery. And they heard it too, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a final, peaceful sigh, as if Thomas had finally found his own way home, through the very fires he had tended for so long. The news of Thomas's passing spread quickly through the crematory community. Many mourned his loss, remembering him as a dedicated, if somewhat eccentric, operator. But a few, those who had heard the whispers, who had felt the unseen presences, understood. They knew that Thomas, the man who had always prided himself on his detachment, had ultimately found his deepest connection in the very heart of his work. He had not just processed the dead, he had guided them, and in the end, he had followed them. The crematory, for those who remained, was no longer just a workplace. It was a sacred space, a thin place where the veil between worlds was permeable, where the echoes of lives lived and journeys taken lingered in the air. And sometimes, on a quiet night, when the hum of the machinery was low, they would feel a gentle warmth and hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a peaceful sigh, a reminder that Thomas, the operator, had finally found his own way home through the very fires he had tended for so long. His confession, unspoken but profoundly felt, was a testament to the enduring mystery of death and the unexpected connections that can be forged in its very presence. And for those who understood, it was a chilling, yet comforting, reminder that some journeys, once begun, are meant to be completed, even if it means stepping through the final flame. These are but a few glimpses into the chilling realities faced by those who work at the edge of life and death. The crematory, a place of finality, often proves to be anything but. The stories you've heard tonight, they serve as a stark reminder that some mysteries remain unsolved, some presences refuse to dissipate, and some echoes linger long after the last flame has died. If these tales have stirred something within you, if they've left you questioning the boundaries of our known world, then you're in good company. The pursuit of the unknown, the unraveling of the inexplicable, is a journey we continue on this channel. For another dive into the truly bizarre and unsettling, I highly recommend our video on What They Saw After Chernobyl Explosion. It's a journey into a different kind of horror, one born of human error and its terrifying consequences. You'll find it on the end screen now. Until next time, keep your lights on and your mind open to the whispers in the dark.